We have everything. We will bring the assembly special meeting to order. We apologize for our tardiness. Dr. Ann Zink was in the house, so we were talking with her for a few moments. And one of the things she shared was she took a run up Mount Roberts and saw 2 mountain goats on the trail. So hopefully if you're going up there, you get to see mountain goats. Anyway, Ms. Hale, would you do the land acknowledgement, please?
Yes, Madam Mayor, thank you. We would like to acknowledge that the city and borough of Juneau is on Tlingit land and wish to honor the indigenous people of this land. For more than 10,000 years, Alaska Native people have been and continue to be integral to the well-being of our community. We are grateful to be in this place, a part of this community, and to honor the culture, traditions, and resilience of the Tlingit people. Gunashish.
Thank you, Ms. Hale. Madam Clerk, will you call roll?
Madam Mayor, Mr. Bryson,
Present.
Miss Hughes Candies,
Here.
Miss Treem,
Here.
Miss Wallaki Doc.
Here.
Okay. Miss Wall,
Present.
Mr. Smith,
Here.
Miss Hale,
Here.
Miss Gladishevsky is not with us tonight, and Mayor Weldon.
Here.
A quorum is present.
All right, that brings us to public participation on non-agenda items. Since you didn't give me a sheet, Ms. McEwen, I'm assuming no one signed up for Zoom and there's
No one signed up for
and no public in the room.
That's my fault for leaving.
Mr. Manager, any changes to the agenda?
Thank you, Mayor. I have one agenda change in your packet. You have a red folder, new version of Resolution 3016, item 4 on the consent agenda. So swapping out the published one for the one in the red folder. Updated version of the CIP.
All right, thank you for that. Any questions on that for anybody? Nope, seeing none. So we'll move to consent agenda. Any public requests for consented agenda changes, but as we said, there are no members of the public. Any assembly requests for consent agenda changes? Assembly action, Ms. Hale.
Thank you, Madam Mayor. I move the consent agenda with one change. Resolution 3016, item 4 is replaced by a new version introduced April 5th. It's a red folder item, and I ask for unanimous consent.
Any objection? Seeing none, we will bring the close of this meeting and go to our finance committee meeting in momentarily. So we are adjourned.
Give me that gavel. Ooh.
Yes, would be the appropriate answer.
Ready? Okay, I will call the Assembly Finance Committee meeting of April 5th to order. Mr. Rogers and Ms. Spiegel have failed to procure sunny weather for us today, so I don't know what's wrong, but maybe next week you can do that. Roll call. Ms. Spiegel, will you please note our roll?
Thank you, Chair Treem. All assembly members are present here in chambers besides for Assembly Member Gladishevsky, who is absent, and Assembly Member Wall and Wachlaw Gadak, who are present virtually on Zoom.
Thank you. Approval of minutes. Any additions or corrections to the minutes from the March 1st meeting? Seeing none, those are approved. Can we get the Zoom view of all the folks who are, so I can tell if they have hands raised?
John, can you change our Zoom view so that we see everybody?
Great segue. Mr. Rogers, can you please introduce your new staff member?
Yes, thank you, Chair Treem. John Neesmith is now with us as the admin assistant supporting the finance admin section in the finance department. Stevie Garlick, who you would have met last time, we promoted as a budget analyst, which is a good outcome. And now John has joined us and he will be here with us on Wednesday nights.
Excellent. Thank you. Oh, perfect. Thank you. Okay, so we will get started with our first agenda topic, summary of the budget. Mr. Rogers, kick us off.
Thank you, Chair Treem. I will ask the esteemed Manager Watt to lead us off.
Thank you. Like every year, the budget is complicated and big, lots of moving parts. It's one of the most important, if not the most important things that the Assembly does. Exercising its power of the purse over municipal operations. We worked very hard on the manager's budget message, which is, I think, on page 21 of the PDF of the budget book. For those who are interested in a high level view of the municipal budget and changes, that is the best place to go. There's a ton of information packed in those 3 or 4 pages. The summary, I think, is almost everything is up. Costs are certainly up. Inflation has driven up the price of everything, commodities, capital projects, labor, all revenues are up. We're projecting a record number of tourists this summer, record high sales tax, all high numbers. In terms of revenue and expenditure. You've certainly heard from property owners about property values being up and concern about what that means for the mill rate. But of course, the property tax burden is the mill rate times the value. So how you set the value will ultimately determine how much more people pay for municipal services. They're certainly not going to pay less for the same municipal services. That's just not possible. And I've heard from a few people that have looked at the budget and they said, great that the manager's message lowers the mill rate a bit, but my assessed value went way up. And the other part of that equation is yes. And we had a lot of inflation and we've had a lot of demand for municipal services. And we have a strong appetite for the services that CBJ provides. So there is a ton of information in this memo. I'll highlight that I proposed adding several positions, which I haven't done in most years, but it's in direct response to needs of the public. And we're going to be working on this hard the next 7 or 8 Wednesday nights, or however many it takes, culminating in adoption of the budget in June. And that's the time you have to do your work. There are a lot of choices to be made, none of them particularly easy, or in the words of former Mayor Sanford, all the easy decisions have already been made. So you don't have attendees here on this rainy Wednesday night, but a lot of people are watching you and really interested in the decisions you make for the community. So welcome to budget season and thank you for your diligence. With that, I'll just pass it over to Mr. Rogers, who will certainly get in more detail than that.
Thank you, Mr. Watt.
Thank you. Chair Tree and Committee, it's just pause for a moment and go backward in time and remind everybody how this all works for real at the city. Staff take direction from the assembly in the retreat in December. That is sort of the formal beginning of the process, but there is a process where Ms. Spiegel and myself and others in CBJ start setting rates, internal service rates and rates for building maintenance and rates for healthcare, all of that. That process starts long before your retreat, usually in the October, November timeframe. Leading up to your retreat, we give you the mid-year budget update, which hopefully puts you on a launch platform to give the manager direction. We work with you during the retreat. We take the direction that you give us, and we spit that direction back out from the manager to the department directors with an indication of what kind of budget the manager expects and what kind of budget the assembly expects from the manager. Departments have 6 to 8 weeks to work on the budgets internally, which is they will touch the budget of every position, the budget of every line in all of their spending in all of their various areas. We get those budgets back from departments in mid-January. We spend a couple of weeks working through technical review on those budgets. We meet with every department face to face. They're kind of a big fun process where we meet with every single department in big meetings with the manager's office. We review every single dollar in every single line in the entire CBJ general government budget with the departments. The manager's office comes away with a list of potential decisions to make. Whether or not they want to endorse, whether the manager will endorse requests that have come from the departments. Those decisions get made generally in early March at the same time that the finance department is putting the finishing touches on revenue projections and coming up with recommendations on mill rate and other mechanical issues. At the same time, we're still really just trying to piece the budget together. Those decisions get wrapped up by mid-March and we start building the budget book. That budget book gets completed, in time enough to print and go in your mailboxes. And we introduce the budget today. I would be remiss not to credit Ms. Spiegel for something like 99% of the work. Obviously, departments have a really considerable investment in their budgets, but on a technical basis, when you see a book this size come together, a tiny bit of that work is mine or the managers, but the vast majority of it is Ms. Spiegel's. And now Stevie Garlick, who was our former admin assistant, is now budget analyst, also participating in that. So credit to Ms. Spiegel for a really good product this year. Okay, with that opening salvo behind us, I think we'll start on pages DOC 1 and DOC 2. Which are on pages 219 and 218 and 219 or 219 and 220 of the PDF copy. This is a similar format. We've tried to keep this same format a few years. I think it's getting easier for folks to understand. On page DOC 1, 219 in the PDF, I won't go through all of this, but I will just we'll start with the first green line. That's the assembly adopted budget. That's the budget that you adopted last year, the total of that budget. You can see all the changes that you have made this year in the supplemental appropriations column, wage and benefit costs, because we made those decisions were made after the budget was adopted. There is a pending request for JSD that is not included yet in the budget book. That's a little unusual that we did that way, but it really helped to track the question better. 2.5 million for Capital Civic Center. You just did 250 for River Road and a few other small things there. And then you see quite a number of revenue changes that were not in the adopted budget. Most importantly, $16 million of state reimbursement of previously unreimbursed school bond debt that was not known when we passed the budget. ARPA funds that were received in FY23, meaning current year rather than last year, the previous year. Sales tax revenues well above forecast to the tune of $6.9 million. All of those things add up to $31.3 million of unanticipated revenue. That's a lot. That is not normally what we would expect to see there, but we live in an unusual time. I think that probably, I mean, cross our fingers, we have seen the last of the unusual time circumstances, and you should expect budgets to proceed in a more status quo way going forward. Still $1 million anticipated lapse. I think that number is probably fair. Obviously, we used to project years ago 1 million, and we projected 1.5 million. We had lapses that were much larger than that. Inflation is eating away at that lapse in the current year. So we do not expect that lapse to be many millions. I think 1 million is a fair planning number for now. You can see that leaves us at the end of the current fiscal year, FY23, ending June 30th, with about $18 million in general fund. And I'm sorry, an $18 million surplus. I'm sorry. And then unrestricted fund balance of 28 million as of the end of FY23. That becomes the starting point for the FY24 budget, $28 million in fund balance.
Ms. Zink.
Thank you. And I'm just trying to think of it in red versus black. So the anticipated lapse is $1 million. But that's listed as an expenditure. And I thought if it lapsed, would that not go back into the kitty?
Yeah, thank you, Assemblymember Hale. It here is listed as a positive number in a column full of negative numbers. So it offsets expenditures.
Okay, thank you. Sorry, didn't see that.
Nope, no problem. Okay, so going on to the top of the next page, which is in the budget book as DOC 2, and I believe in the PDF is page 220. This is the building of the FY24 budget. There is no page in your book that better summarizes everything that's changed in the budget than this page. There's quite literally nothing that has changed in the general government fund budget that isn't listed here in one way or another. We start building the budget from the top to the bottom, and I'm going to walk all the way through this because I'm going to tell you the whole budget right now. We take the prior year adopted budget as the starting place, and then we add to it and subtract from it to get to an adjusted base. We added the FY23 wage and benefit costs and the FY24 wage and benefit costs. And the reason that has to happen is because the prior year adopted budget hadn't yet funded last year's or the current year's wage and benefit costs because we hadn't made those decisions yet. So you see that reflected there twice. You also see $1 million of merit increases and other personnel actions. As you know, employees get merit increases annually or biannually based on their performance. You see a $900,000 increase to 1% voter approved projects. This is something we try to keep seamed up mostly together as sales tax, as the total sales tax goes up, the 1% of 5% gets to be a bigger and bigger number. The manager respects that and funded more in 1% voter approved. We see that as a part of the adjusted base rather than a decision. Increase to general sales tax projects. It keeps current with what we have been thinking about as the 1% that we spend on streets and other infrastructure projects. There is a percent when we put it in front of the voters that we earmark as streets and other related infrastructure. That amount too, we see as kind of a formula. The 390 actually reverses one-time revenue and one-time expenditures from the prior year, which is the reason it's a positive number. On the revenue side, building the adjust base, you see sales tax growth of 9.7 million over prior year. Property tax growth of a little more than 5 million. That's based on the manager's proposed mill rate of 10.28 mils. You see investment income growth over FY23. In part, that's because FY23 investment income was so muted, but we do expect investment returns to normalize. And then as interest rates fall again, the value of our portfolio will go up again. So we will see excess returns again as interest rates fall. We may start to see some of that in 23. We'll certainly, or in 2024, we'll certainly see it in 25. Tobacco tax from MIH, the assembly made a decision last year to pull back tobacco tax. I'm sorry, am I getting this right? No, I'm sorry. Ms. Spiegel, why does this change? Remind me. I don't know.
If I may, the assembly made the decision during the FY23 budget process to wait a year and then reallocate the tobacco tax from Bartlett to fund the expanded MIH program in FY '24.
Right. And so some of you have noted that the hospital lost that money, and we'll come back around to that discussion. But in the meantime, it means more tobacco caps comes into the general fund budget instead of going to the hospital. Department revenue growth, that's all kinds of user fees, just everything that grows naturally. You don't have a lot of control over that. Liquor and marijuana tax growth. Part of the reason that we have an adjusted base kind of structure like this is that this is an area where there's very limited decision making. The manager makes little to no decisions here. You have little to no ability to impact these numbers, with a couple of exceptions. But for the most part, these are things by which these things happen like gravity. They're going to happen, and there's no real good way to stop them. The adjusted base budget would produce, without any other changes, a $5.2 million surplus, considering this property tax, right? And obviously we'll have lots of conversations both today and later about property tax, but the adjusted base budgets on its own would produce a $5.2 million surplus. Are there any more questions about the adjusted?
There
base?
are. Mayor Weldon.
Sorry, I have to backtrack a minute because I was looking for it and I didn't see it. Going back to your investment and income over FY '23 adopted budget, seems to me that, and I could be remembering it wrong, our investment income was actually a negative in FY '23, or we didn't do great on that one. Is this bringing it back to normal, or is this just better than it was last time?
Mayor Weldon, I think what I should do is, this is a little unorthodox. We don't normally do it, but we've had such a weird period. I think we might put a little update on investment income on an AFC agenda in the next, in the budget process. That would probably be helpful. We don't normally do that, but we've gone through such a weird period. We actually have a clear picture of that from our investment advisor, and I think it's worth putting that in front of you again. And we'll do that next meeting or the meeting after. And I'm sorry to punt, but I think that's actually helpful. Okay. So moving forward from that adjusted base, you start seeing all the things that have been added to the budget by the manager as part of the budget process, hopefully in response to assembly direction and community need. You do see JSD additional up to the cap instructional funding. This amount, 2.3 million, is reflective of any number of things. And when we have the school district in front of us next week, hopefully they make this clear, or I'm starting to get better at drawing the picture of how this happens from our view. $2.3 million of additional funding happens largely because our assessed valuation has gone up so significantly, and the Juneau Assembly has historically funded to the cap, and JSD has requested that you continue funding to the cap. This amount, 2.284,600, is only funding up to the cap, but it is inclusive of the 2.65 mil requirement for minimum local contribution, and that's based on full and true value. It's not based on our borough assessed value, and we could talk about the difference between those, but it may not matter. And also the optional allowable contribution of 2 mils. So that 4.65 mils, given the property value growth that we've seen, induces another $2.3 million of additional spending on the school district, all on its own, without any change in overall direction. I was sharing with Madam Mayor today, there is a portion of that funding that supplants state funding, as in state funding goes down because it's supplanted by local funding. There is a portion of that funding that is purely additive to the school district. As the amount of the allowable up to the cap funding increases, that amount does not supplant state funding. So this amount, in a way that we could quantify, does represent some amount of truly additional funding, new funding, instructional funding for the school district. Next line, professional services inflation. You're seeing everything in this line. We consolidate this. This is all kinds of service contracts that CBJ has. Everything's getting more expensive. For example, there was a discussion at the committee of the whole on Monday night about the increase in the animal control contract. That contract is getting more expensive like every other contract. The increase for that contract, or a presumed increase for that contract, is buried here or included here. Fleet replacement. The city uses a fleet replacement fund as its primary mechanism for replacing vehicles, including fire apparatus. We use this fund to operationalize the fact that we might buy 9 police cars one year and 0 the next. So we operationalize that cost and level it out over time. That said, fleet costs are really going up very rapidly. We are paying more for vehicles. The city is trying to make good on various commitments to electrify our fleet where possible. So we are going to see, this is a sizable increase for fleet. I think it's been some time coming. You might not see an increase this size every year, but it's necessary. IT, we do see significant additional spending on an operating basis in IT. You can see the products there that it includes. This is not exclusive, but we are paying for O365, multi-factor authentication, other things that keep us safe, including Adobe products. It is for any of you who've ever been in an organization that transitioned from off-the-shelf Microsoft to O365, it's an expensive proposition, but it does bring us into the modern world for IT. Dependent care assistance is something that the manager brought forward as a recruitment and retention tool. This is what we have modeled as the cost for this. This is based on a per employee rate and what we think will be utilization in FY24. That number is likely to continue going up somewhat more over time. General supplies inflation, this includes fuel. Everything's getting, it includes certain fuel, but not heating oil. Everything we buy that comes in a barrel, a jug, a bag is getting more expensive. So you see all of that cost inflation or most of it reflected there. The 457 deferred compensation employer match, this is the number that we have modeled is what we think is likely in the first year of the program. That it seems like fairly inexpensive in comparison to what I showed you before. We do think that that program will ramp up over a number of years until we get to a point of sort of final utilization, but it'll take a little time. We think we've probably modeled sufficient cost to accommodate that. An increase to the public defender's contract is likely is called out individually there. Utilities, electricity and heating oil, some of that is inflation and what we forecast is the cost of fuel. Some of it is also usage. Travel and training, that's really reflective of continuing to normalize post-pandemic. You will not see these kind of increases in travel and training forever. We took huge reductions in the pandemic and we're finally building back to a normal base. Facilities maintenance, you can see some of these items start to get smaller. You do see a couple of positions here, a business analyst and IT to manage the really significant number of IT infrastructure projects that are happening. A new commercial appraiser for the assessor's office. We've had 7 people working in the assessor's office for a very long time. We are advancing the idea that an additional appraiser in that office who would focus on commercial properties is in the best interest of the community. Insurance increases, these are not as big as they have been in some recent years, but still another $100,000 of insurance for general government. An increase to the warming shelter, other commodities and services inflation, just random things that didn't fit somewhere else, lease, parking increases. A PCN and funding or a position and funding for the Zach Gordon Youth Center. This is about summer youth programs. I think there will be at later point in the process where we will have a narrative on all of these positions, the sort of program additions. So look for that later on in the process. An assembly grant for AEYC. There was some discussion. We will get to talking about this when we talk about assembly grants. There was some discussion last year about whether or not AEYC needed operating funding or not. It's been Mr. Barr's determination that AEYC would benefit from an assembly grant to continue their base operations. So we've put it in the manager's budget. 2 half-time positions in HR. In part, one of those fills out a half-time position and another one in part is just a new half-time position. We have, I think, internally felt like human resources was understaffed and was making recruitment and retention more difficult and making us a little less entrepreneurial. So we're trying to level that. A half-time aquatics instructor, that's actually that's not really one person, it's many people, but 0.6 FTEs. A Treadwell recreation coordinator that just fills out, I believe, what is currently a position that's budgeted at slightly less than full time. And then you see additional full cost. That positive number there means that we are billing out more central service costs to the enterprises based on their use and our own costs. So that's why that is a positive number in the expenditure category. So that is us building the manager's budget from the adjusted base to what we consider the adjusted base plus recurring revenues and recurring expenditures. This is the first time we've made this distinction. I do think probably It is a good thing for you to continue, good thing for the budget section to continue trying to help the assembly understand during the budget process, the differential impact between recurring revenue and recurring expenditure and non-recurring revenue and expenditure. Any questions down that far?
Thank you, Madam Chair. I think I know, but just to be sure, we approved allowing the manager to issue signing bonuses. That's not showing up here because that just reduces lapse. Is that right? Okay.
That's
Thank-
some members, that's correct. We assume that the signing bonus program that has been designed by the manager and the HR department only is recruiting for positions that are very difficult to fill. By virtue of them being very difficult to fill, there's some portion of the year where they are vacant. That vacancy is what allows us to pay for a signing bonus.
Thank you for that. Another one, back to the school district funding. And I'm sorry if you said it and I just didn't capture it before. So the addition on the top line up there, 2.3 million is just due that is if the assembly funds to the cap, and that is just due to the increase in the whatever the full value determination or something, correct? Does it anywhere in here show the outside the cap funding yet, or do we just not know that?
Thank you, Assemblymember Smith. So the manager's budget includes the same amount of outside the cap funding that you authorized last year for the school district. It excludes, it does not include the school district's additional request for new outside the cap funding for FY24 that they will bring forward to you next week. Thank you.
Another one? Go ahead.
Sorry, now kind of going, well, bridging the gap between FY23 and 24. So things that were funded. I guess, off the pending list. I know that's the name has changed or whatever, but things like the JCF social services block grants and that type of thing. Are those included in the FY24 budget? Anything from that section, are those included in the FY24 numbers or no?
Assemblymember Smith, all of the assembly grants are included in the manager's budget in the way that you appropriated them last year, unless you told us they were one time and then they've been removed. And I will say there is one exception to that, which is that we would have assumed that the Juneau Commission on Aging grant would have continued. The Juneau Commission on Aging is no longer using JEDC for its administration, and we used to issue that grant to JEDC. That's been zeroed out in the FY24 budget. I do know that the Assembly has a request from the Juneau Commission on Aging to continue providing it administrative support. And I think during the budget process, you'll need to consider how you want to do that. But that amount has been removed from the budget. All the other Assembly grants, with the exception of AEYC, where we have included $75,000, remain unchanged from their FY23 levels.
Microphone.
Sorry, so things like, and maybe you can I don't know if it's easier to just go through them now, or if you want to give us a list or follow up later, but like the Heat Smart Operations Grant, are we that I just can't remember what's one time and what's continuing and whatever. I mean, I guess I just trust you that's.
If you turn to page 84 of the budget book, I think this is a fine sidebar. We're going to need to get to all this anyway. Page 84 of the budget book is the place where your assembly grants are detailed, not summarized, but detailed. You will see the arts and humanities, same amount, social service grants. Oh, there is a change to the social service grant, which is that we have rolled Jamie's grant into the amount managed by JCF, but the amounts are exactly the same. All these grants remain unchanged. There is an additional amount from childcare that actually comes from the 1% sales tax. Travel Juneau's grant changes by virtue of the fact that the hotel bed tax amount is up. But if you get down to answer Assemblymember Smith's question, you get down to Heat Smart. They had a $250,000 award last year. The Assembly indicated last year that that was a one-time award and it was not issued or was not included in the manager's budget for 24. Again, I do know that Heat Smart intends to come forward with a request for funding in FY 24 also. And same thing with the $10,000 on Juneau Commission on Aging. It was in the approved budget. It's been removed from the manager's revised FY 24 budget.
Ms. Hale, did you have a question too?
Yeah, and it's just following on Mr. Smith's questions. I can't remember what we're calling the pending list, but do we have a pending list already? And would that, if Juneau Commission on Aging comes to request that funding, would that go on the pending list? I mean, how do we think about
We-
that starting right now?
It's coming.
It's coming.
It's coming.
Okay, thank you.
I have a little bit of work to do with Mr. Rogers and Ms. Spiegel on how it will be presented. But I have heard from, other folks, they've already been in touch with Ms. Spiegel. She's collecting those and I just need to work with them on how we're going to present it.
Thank you.
Okay,
Ms. Huskilles.
Thank you, Madam Chair. And Mr. Rogers, my apologies if this was one of the ones you just detailed out. You know, sometimes you're looking at it and thinking your own thoughts, so I might have missed it. But the social service grants, the amount in the 24, never mind. It's the difference between the approved budget and the revised budget.
yeah, just to
Yeah.
make that perfectly clear. So you see in the approved budget, that's the budget that you would have approved as the second year last year. That included 410, 400 for JAMI and 1,393,500 for social services. You just see those two amounts added together in the revised FY 24 budget. So JCF will manage the JAMI grant on CBJ's behalf.
Just on behalf. Okay, thank you.
Okay, back on page DOC 2, page 220, I think in the PDF. So that got us down through the adjusted base plus the recurring revenues expenditures. We do have two non-recurring revenue items. LATCF, I can never remember what that acronym means, but it is what we think of as probably the very last tranche of federal funding related to the pandemic. It drops into FY 24. We do expect to receive it in 24. SCMT, that is our supplemental emergency medical transport program. That's a federal program that we apply to through the state that supports Medicaid transport, ambulance transports. That $400,000 is catch up from the prior year, and we expect to receive it next year. It's one-time revenue. You shouldn't expect it again. So two bits of non-recurring revenue, but then also managers made a bold proposal to insert 3 items here into the budget. 2 of them are now reflected in the CIP. First is a $10 million investment in New City Hall. Obviously, New City Hall is a much more expensive project than that, but that would seed that project with general funds in a way that we have been talking about and considering for some time. The manager has proposed that as part of the budget. A $4 million contribution to the restricted budget reserve. There's a page here on the restricted budget reserve that we can look at tonight or another time. And $2 million for a JPD radio system upgrade. Again, that seeds that project. That's a very expensive project, long time moving and going. But we think it's important to start making kind of deposits into that project. And then this is an unusual item, but we have added $50,000 for New City Hall advocacy here. This is the clear indication that CBJ in its budget will have budgeted to advocate on behalf of a new City Hall ballot measure. Obviously, if the Assembly chose not to advance a new City Hall ballot measure, that money would not necessarily be spent. But we have included that in the budget. We do see it as critical to the new City Hall project and the public's education and understanding of the importance of that project.
Okay. Mr. Bryson and then Ms. Huskilles.
Just a quick question about City Hall. I believe that we had already set aside $5 million previously to, as like a down payment in City Hall, or $6 million. 6 million already. Is this 10 million in addition to that? So we'll now have 16 million. That's real meat and potatoes.
Can you nod your head louder, Mr. Watt?
Yes, I'm confirming what Mr. Bryson said, 10 on top of 6.
That's awesome. Thank you very much, Mr. Watt.
Ms. Hughes Candies.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Question, Mr. Rogers, about the LATCF funding. This is our first payment and we're expecting is that correct? Did I understand that correctly? And then we would expect 1.3 the next year as well.
So if you, Assemblymember Hughes Candies, if it's actually the second payment.
Okay.
And if you look back on the page before this, line 228, local and tribal assistant. This is
Consistency.
local assistance and tribal consistency fund. No wonder I couldn't remember.
Ms. Hughes Candies knows what it is.
That is half the amount. You see that same number on both pages.
Thank you. So a question about that. That is one of my favorite flavors of all the different COVID money we've received because it is so flexible in its use. Do you happen to know offhand, and if you don't, that's fine, we can follow up. I've heard some interesting things of because there's not that same period of performance or expiration date on these funds. And the reporting just continues until you spend it. Some communities are like looking into investing it to grow that. Are you aware of the allowability on if we were to say invest these on the second payment, what the use of the investment earnings would be?
I think it will probably help me to explain it slightly differently. For the vast majority of the pandemic related funding we got, it had some range of allowability. In all of that funding, the advantage we had is that we had expenditures that we would normally pay for with general funds that were eligible in the operating budget. We call this washing federal money, and that's not a untoward term. It's just that we take federal money, we spend it on allowable things where we would have spent general funds, and we preserve the general funds. We will do the exact same thing with both tranches of LATCF. So we will fully expense LATCF in the year that it's received on eligible expenditures, but the net result is that it saves you that amount of general funds. So that amount of general funds simply winds up in unrestricted fund balance, and that unrestricted fund balance is invested in the same way as all of our other fund balance.
Thanks, that's super helpful.
Ms. Hale.
Thank you, Madam Chair. And we'll probably get to this on the next page, our favorite graph. But Mr. Rogers, do you feel comfortable with that estimated 12.6 million left in unrestricted fund balance?
Yeah, thank you, Assemblymember. I think that's a totally apt question, right? Do I feel confident, meaning do I think our revenues and expenditures are well forecast and planned? And I think the answer is yes. Certainly in recent years, we're going to talk through revenue. Revenue projections are big, but they're coming back bigger than I expect. I mean, so I will come to that question a little bit more when we talk specifically about the revenue projections. But otherwise, yes, I do think it is reasonable to think that you'll end FY24 somewhere in that range, or that you would have that much to make other supplemental appropriations with next year as they became emergent.
That's great. And then the other question, and again, I think before we get to this, is does that dollar amount as a fund balance at the end of the year, if we got close to that, would you as finance director feel that that's a good fund balance for us to have?
Yeah, thank you, Assemblymember Hill. We've talked ad nauseum about this. And I don't mean us. I mean, we talk about it a lot at the staff level. I actually think that $12.5 million is still higher than it needs to be for an unrestricted fund balance. One of the things that's also happening in the FY24 budget, and we're going to look at it very specifically on the next page, is or you see it here, but you're going to see the impact of it, which is to grow the restricted budget reserve by $4 million. That makes that fund, that emergency fund, even that much more robust for dealing with an economic downturn, for dealing with a disaster or an emergency that's unforeseen. As the restricted fund balance grows, at least to meet the aspiration of the resolution, but also just becomes bigger and bigger and bigger, it really does depressure the question about how much money you need in unrestricted fund balance. We've tried to be consistent in saying you need enough money in unrestricted fund balance so that you as an assembly can make decisions without feeling hamstrung. I don't know that there's any amount that I would say you need to have 3 million or 4 million or 5 million in unrestricted fund balance. I think that's probably about the amount you need to have purely so that you feel like you have a little flexibility to say yes to something without having to immediately dip to the restricted budget reserve. For whatever it's worth, Angie Flick is CBJ treasurer sitting in the back of the room, wrote her PhD thesis on local government fund balance and studied the largest county government in every state, right?
No way.
And tried to analyze trends about how much fund balance counties thought was appropriate. Ms. Flick's finding was that there is absolutely no pattern and no explanation for what the largest county in every state does in terms of its thinking about fund balance. But one thing that she and I were talking about the other day that I think
Mr. Rogers, can I, sorry to
Yep.
interrupt you. Mr. Neesmith, can you go back to the Zoom? I think I'm not seeing hands that were
You can-
raised
Ms.
or,
Spiegel will stop sharing.
oh, wait, but I was seeing I was not seeing Zoom. I was seeing,
That Ms. Spiegel was presenting into
Oh.
the Zoom.
okay. Yes, and Ms. Wall has her hand up and I didn't mean to interrupt you, but
I'll just finish this tiny thing by saying, one thing that Ms. Flick's research did demonstrate is that the way that communities make funding decisions, particularly on infrastructure, does impact thinking about fund balance. And the biggest distinction is, do communities pay for infrastructure projects in a what we call pay-go way, which means that they don't use debt or that they do use debt. So we see some communities that let fund balance grow very high with the intention to spend it on something big, and then it's lower, and they let it grow again and they spend it on something big, and they may not use debt. You see other communities that have the advantage of a more stable, potentially general fund balance, unrestricted fund balance, because they use debt to pay for those things, and then they're managing debt service as a cost. So there's not really a demonstrable pattern. Sometimes people ask me, what's the best practice for fund balance? And I'm like, your resolution for the restricted budget reserve is the best practice. You're already doing it. You could draw unrestricted fund balance basically to zero and you'd still be following that best practice because you have enough money set aside.
thank you, Mr. Rogers. Can we get a copy of the dissertation before our fund balance or our restricted budget reserve item comes before us?
Not me, please. I did have one more follow-up, but I know Ms. Wall has.
Oh, okay. Let me go to Ms. Wall. 'Cause I
Okay,
think She's
thanks.
been waiting for a while.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I don't think mine's too far off topic. My question is really about the non-recurring revenues and kind of the relationship to fund balance and the budget reserve. I remember, and not super well, a conversation at the retreat where kind of the body was weighing how much money to spend versus how much to save, given our considerable fund balance. And I think we had a conversation about the restricted budget reserve at the time. And this isn't to be like, did you do what we told you to? But I'm curious, like, is this similar to where we were at that time, or has the manager's kind of opinions changed since we had that conversation about the size that we would be spending on one-time non-recurring revenues, including contributing to the budget reserve?
Mr. Watt?
I think the thinking is always evolving, but no, not really. So going back into the retreat, I think, the message was pick a couple big things and do a couple big things. It's a big fund balance that we have, and I think most communities would feel very, very fortunate to have a restricted budget reserve as large as we have, and a general fund balance as large as we have both. I think most communities, if you had one or the other proportionately to the size of the budget, they'd be happy. So I feel quite comfortable in all of these recommendations, and no, I don't think the philosophy's really changed.
So I really truly love this conversation, but I also want to be sensitive to the length of our meetings, and I believe we'll talk about this very issue in the future. So let's wrap it up with Ms. Hale's follow-up.
Thank you. Thank you. I thought you were going to cut me off. I was like, oh. The reason I'm asking these questions is this assembly has stated that affordable housing and housing is our highest priority. And I like the idea of the 10 million for New City Hall, but I don't like the idea of us not having considerable sums to put towards housing in whatever way we can come up with. So I just want to make sure that that 12 million that's left is going to be enough for us to actually substantially contribute to housing in this community. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Hale. Oh, Mr. Smith.
Thank you. I hopefully this is quick too. The numbers presented in this include the CIP. Is that correct? Okay. So then just a follow-up on that. That means there is no growth in CIP spending between FY 23 and 24, except for, I guess you'd consider maybe new City Hall and the radio, right? So are those things flat? Year 23.
Assemblymember Smith, not exactly. So if you go up to the top of this, what is, I believe, lines 243 and 244, you see an additional 900,000 for 1% projects. You see an additional 425,000 for general sales tax. So those are increased investments in the CIP. You don't see the projects reflected here, but that is growth over last year's similar CIP categories.
Okay, thank you. And then just one follow-up thing. The other thing that just from the manager's message that I just want, or I'm going to keep in mind is that, we may require match for Infrastructure Jobs Act funding. So before that 12 million goes away, I want to make sure we think about that too. So thanks.
Okay.
Saying it's going away.
Okay, so okay.
Yeah, we're only an hour in. We can't get this crazy yet. Mr. Rogers.
I'm getting squirrely too. Okay. Making a note. Okay, so on page DOC2, just finishing this real quick. So you can see at the bottom of this, I'll point out one number there. It says adjusted base plus recurring revenue and expenditure changes leaves you a -$1 million. That's what we think of as lapse. So when we get to the mill rate, we'll talk to you about how we calculated the mill rate, but that number is quite intentional. It's not particularly random. And then the one-time items result in a non-recurring deficit of 15.3 million, which would reduce the $28 million of unrestricted fund balance down to 12.6. And I think if I can just not even take a breath and get you to move to the next page, you can now see what that looks like in context. It's actually really funny. I was thinking this today when I was looking over this and thinking about this meeting. I created this graph a couple of years ago because I was responding to your desire to kind of see how it all fit over a long period of time. I don't think I could have ever drawn these years. They are so unusual. I don't think I would have ever said, maybe this is what it will look like in a couple of years. To have had, to have gotten to at the end of, for example, at the end of FY21 to a fund balance of 28.5 million, and then to draw it down by 18.5 million, and then to see it rocket back up to 28 million, and then to propose to draw it back down by 15 million. I mean, those kind of swings, I tell you, are really very anomalous. I don't think anybody should expect this kind of activity forever. I think it is reflective of, if you remember the PTSD of having gone through the budget process during the pandemic, where in the beginning there was this real need to clamp. I mean, we cut lots of things, we stopped projects, and then the federal money started to roll in and more federal money. And then there was like, no, we got to put all that money back and we got to do a lot of spending, but those things didn't always happen in the same years. And then more federal money rolled in. I mean, so we're finally, I think, seeing the pandemic and the very anomalous and unusual financial activity kind of finally play out. We will get back to something that feels like normal with a typical sustainable level of unrestricted fund balance. I don't think you'll see these swings. This will have been a strange aberration of history, I think.
You should take that graph with you when you leave. Ms. Spiegel, I am not seeing the Zoom. Is there a way we can see this, but also see like the little boxes in the upper corner?
Chair Dream, I'm not sure that you can. I will try to keep
Okay.
an eye on hands being raised by Assemblymember Wall and Wachlaw Gadak
Okay.
and stop sharing when I see those hands.
Okay, that would be great.
Raised.
Thank you.
Okay.
Or you guys could text me. I just want to make sure I'm not missing them. Okay, thank you.
Any questions about this particular graph? You've seen this for a number of years. It's just very, very unusual. We were trying to paint a picture up until FY21, and that was a strange enough picture. And now, boy, look what's happened. So, but it does give you a sense. One thing I'll point out is that you can see, so focus on the peach orange colored part of this graph. That's the restricted budget reserve. You see it climbs up to its sort of peak of 16.55 million in FY19. And then we issued out to JEDC $3 million. Here we reflect that $3 million comes back in 1 million at a time. It didn't quite happen like that, but it doesn't really matter. We do reflect that money being fully back into the restricted budget reserve as of the end of FY23. That's this June 30th. There's a little timing difference there, but it doesn't move the numbers. And then you can see at the very tail end of that little upshoot of that orange part of the graph is the restricted budget reserve growing in a real way for the first time in a number of years. So that is the $4 million additional. And really what you start to see here is a picture that starts to develop of the restricted general fund reserve being really the meat of that pie, and unrestricted fund balance being a kind of a layer on the top that can be used, you know, either to meet an emergent need or save it and spend it or whatever you want to do.
Yeah, that's exactly what I was thinking.
Sure. Okay. All right. I'm going to do one more thing here, just page 4 of this restricted budget reserve. You kind of see the math here. The reason that we've chosen 4 million is that the resolution specifically says based on general government revenues from the most recently audited financial statements, that for us is FY22. So third line from the bottom, and the third line from the bottom says that the amount that would theoretically be due to the restricted budget reserve in addition would be 3.794. We've rounded that up to 4 million because that number will continue to grow considerably in FY23 and FY24. But so that number didn't come from nowhere.
I do have a question on this. This chart or this table assumes that we're getting all of the COVID loan appropriation back, and we're probably not going to get 100%, but we don't have to pay all of it back because it's a resolution and we only had to come up with a plan to pay it back. But I just want to make sure that, do we have to pay it back, all of it?
Yeah, thank you, Chair Treem. I think tomato. Obviously, if you make a multi-million-dollar contribution to the restricted budget reserve, you will have grown it. You can consider that you have paid it back. We do expect very, very, very high recovery on the COVID loan programs. I think that reflects well in the community. It reflects well on JEDC's work. There are a number of loans that are fully delinquent. I'm actually in the process with JEDC of transferring those debts formally into CVJ kind of receivership, because we have tools JEDC doesn't have to recover those funds. We will do everything in our power to recover funds that were loaned by CVJ from the restricted budget reserve.
What does that include? What is everything in our power?
we will eventually attempt to garnish them like any other debt. So we have all sorts of different mechanisms we can use to recover debts that are due to the city. I mean, eventually we take organizations to court one way or the other.
Mr. Bryson.
We know the total amount still outstanding or the total amount that's delinquent.
Yeah, that Ms. Beagle whispered the same number that I'm thinking. I think we have about 200,000 that's still outstanding. I have to look at Mr. Holt's most current report. There's an amount somewhere south of 100,000 that is fully delinquent with businesses that are no longer a going concern. They will be difficult to recover. But I think that that's probably the outside boundary of what you could, at some point, it might be sensible for the assembly to say, we're going to take $100,000 of general funds and effectively write off those loans. We will not write them off at this point anyways. We will continue to try and recover them, but.
Mr. Smith.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Just looking, I mean, the resolution and obviously backed up by the recommended reserve target of using revenues, and it's just really interesting to see that massive growth in the significant growth in the revenues between, you know, of hovering around a little over 100 million and now going up to 144. So necessitating more into the budget reserve. But again, I don't know if I totally understand why it's not more of a expenditure thing. But I guess my real question is, we did in the 1% sales tax, we did direct that $1 million or something be added to the budget reserve, correct? But I mean, that's, was it 2?
I think, Mr. Smith, I think it's 2, and
Okay.
I think it's in the 1% plan is $400,000 a year.
Okay.
If I'm not mistaken.
Okay, got it. And again, I mean, it helps some. Obviously, we have the numbers are bigger than that, but that would be, I mean, at some point that will start showing. I mean, that would be an addition in the first edition would be in FY24 of that 400,000 or something, right?
Yes, Assemblymember Smith, I
Okay.
believe so. I don't have the 1% plan in front of me.
Okay.
But there might be a 1-year delay. We could look at this.
Just wanted to make sure it's going in. Thanks.
No, I'm sorry. We've been speaking out of turn. We're getting things confused here. There's 1 million destined to the restricted budget reserve, and it's been placed out in FY28.
It's 1 million.
I think just to be clear about the point, you will not overfill the restricted budget reserve with this 4 million, nor will the 1 million in FY28 bring it to too high a balance. Okay, any questions on pages DOC 3 and DOC 4? If not, we're going to move on agenda items to the overview of major revenues. And I know we're probably getting a little long in the tooth tonight and we have a lot to get through. So I won't maybe belabor this as much as I sometimes do, because this format should be getting familiar to you. So on page DOC.
You guys want to do a break? 5-minute break? Okay, we can do a 5-minute break.
Thanks. Okay, I'll move through the major revenues. So starting with sales tax actuals and forecast. This is the same format you have seen before, and I will start with the FY23 budget. You see that amount by quarter there, including remote sales tax, that totaled 55.7. That's current year. We did show you during the mid-year budget update the first quarter actual exceeding 20 million. That was a big quarter that none of us really saw coming quite like that. And then also outperformance in the October to December quarter to the tune of $720,000. The January to March quarter is still a projection. But that number we have reprojected based on the FY22 January to March quarter, which was actually higher than the projection we have. We think there was something anomalous a little about that number. We'll have that Q3 projection here in not too long. $16 million projection for the April to June quarter. That's the quarter we started 5 days ago. So a little outperformance there that's based on the 15.1 mark from last year. We know we've had more inflation. We're going to have more tourists. That number still could be too low, but what it results at the end and growth in remote sales tax, that's unexpected. We'll get that on the next page, but we do see what we forecast now to be 62.3 million of sales tax in the current year, FY23. That's $6.6 million higher than the budget. So you scrolling down to FY24, what's listed here is FY20. This is consistent through all these charts. I might have changed these words if I thought about it, but FY24 budget means what we had in last year's budget for FY24, and FY24 forecast means what we have in this year's budget. So that, I'm sorry, that language is a little imperfect. But so you can see that we are now projecting for FY24, July to September, that's the quarter starting July 1st, 21.2 million. The October to December quarter is 12.3 million, 11.1 million January to March, and 16.8 million April to June, totaling 65.4 million with a little more growth in remote sales tax. That is $8 million higher than the FY24 budget, which didn't mean much. It is 9.7 million higher, some number you don't see listed here, higher than what we expected now in FY23. So or what we expected in the FY23 budget. So just overall, a lot of growth. You can see two charts here where you kind of see what that looks like. I do think you're starting to finally see in the chart on the very bottom of this page, that dark blue bar is getting to be a little, in the very bottom chart, getting to be a little bigger piece of the overall picture. Remote sales tax is really becoming a thing. So questions on sales tax?
Mr. Rogers, do you think we can or should ever get to a point where we don't break out remote sales tax from the rest of it?
Chair Treem, I think exactly, yes. Finance has been using this as a tool. I think we would continue to break out remote sales tax for projection purposes until it plateaus and moves in the same way that normal sales tax does. After that, we would stop doing it. Moving on.
Andy's.
Oh, I'm sorry.
But just a quick follow-up on that. Have you forecasting's a hard thing anyway, and these have been crazy years. Do you find remote sales tax has its own, does it seem like it's following the quarters, like has its own season sort of, or is that, I think of online shopping as being totally different, consistent year rounds. Oh, it's on the next page. Mayor says.
Yes, thank you, Assemblymember Huskandies, for transitioning us to the next page of the packet.
All I needed was the look over.
I think that if you just ignore the regular charts and just look at the month by month returns, we actually get these returns month by month, and so we look at them this way. They are equivalent month to month, and that's not true for our other taxes. If you were to look, you can definitely see that the largest number in every year is December, and now there's obvious reasons why that's the case. Eventually, you like in 22, it's interesting because the December number was 258,000. That was a high watermark, except, and we retreat a lot in January and February to lower numbers, except for the fact that that number in December did get outpaced by June, and that just represents normal growth of the program, more registered businesses really that we're collecting for. When you start looking at the 2 quarters leading into this year, we get up to a high watermark in December of 339 million. That's a big number. If you just multiply that by 12, it's much higher than 3.5 or 4 million. But you can see in January, we went down all the way to 268,000. That was a bit of a surprise for us. That number seemed low. So we there's just a tiny-ish bit of uncertainty about what the future of remote sales tax is. I think that probably our forecast of 3.46 million in the current year and our forecast of 4 million for next year is still very much in the ballpark. The program will continue to grow as they register sellers. We have still not managed to register Google, for example. So. I don't know that I'll belabor remote sales tax any more than that unless there are questions. Okay, hotel bed tax has been interesting, and it has grown in ways that were just very unpredictable. You do see this tremendous post-pandemic surge. The FY23 budget had been 2.09 million. We now forecast for the current year, the year ending June 30th, 3.3 million. That's about the wrongest projection I could possibly make, or budget to projection. I mean, it's just so significant. We do expect a full $1 million of sales tax in the April to June quarter, the quarter that we're in. I mean, if you go back to the beginning of this chart, we got 1.5 million of sales tax in the entire year, not that long ago. So I'm sorry, I'm saying sales tax. I meant hotel bed tax. Thank you, Assemblymember Hale.
Mr. Bryson has a question.
Thank you. Does the hotel bed tax number increase? Could that be coming from short-term rental head tax? Or any thoughts on that?
Thank you, Assemblymember Bryson. It's coming from everything. It's coming from low availability, really significant demand. I can tell you that it's not just coming from short-term rentals. And the reason we know that is that the finance department gets confidential data from Travel Juno. And what I believe they call is, I can't remember what the report is, but we get revenue numbers back from the hotels, and the average nightly rate for hotels is just sky high. It's really, 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 really grown. So, the bulk of what you're seeing as new revenue is just coming from standalone hotels that are charging really, really significant rates. I don't know what theory we would have to think that they're going to charge lower rates in the future if, as we see summer visitation pick back up. So at the same time, this is probably the most cautious projection in the entire budget, which is that I only project 3.42 in the next year versus 3.32 this year. I just don't know. We're on such an incredible growth trajectory. It's hard to imagine we continue that magnitude of growth. But I also don't think we go backward either. So. Yeah, I don't know if there's anything more on this. You just see minor growth from 23 to 24, 1.36 million. The new forecast is 1.4 for the first quarter. 460,000 versus 470,000, about $500,000 for January to March in both years, and then about $1 million the April to June quarters both years. This is mostly a flat-ish projection. There's just too many unknowns with hotel tax. Liquor tax, for those of you who don't see liquor tax in the budget, liquor tax rolls right into the sales tax fund. So if you look in the sales tax fund, you'll see a line for it there. Liquor tax over time is relatively predictable. There was some pandemic influence just because people weren't drinking out in bars, and we receive less liquor tax when people buy booze and drink at home. But you can see we had budgeted in 23 1.1 million over the year. We now forecast 1.27 based on very strong returns from the July to September quarter. FY24 was actually budgeted at the same number. We budgeted slightly higher than where we are forecasting for FY23. Again, just a fair amount of uncertainty. These numbers could be too low. Marijuana tax, we are sort of trying to understand if the industry has plateaued, if the industry is saturated in a way. It's also complicated because people are buying lots and lots of different kinds of marijuana products. We've taken marijuana tax on all those products, but people use those products, different people use those products differently. We also expect at some point to see price competition amongst retailers and wholesalers that might have some impact on the amount that people are spending. Ultimately, marijuana tax is just a little hard to project. We have projected 480,000 this year and next.
Mr. Bryson.
Sorry, just curiosity got the best of me. How much marijuana does Juno sell in a year? How do we come up with this number? like gross revenue?
We tax retail sale price of marijuana and it's 3%. Am I getting this right? 3% on top of the 5% sales tax.
So this 0.48. All right, I'll ask you the math later. I was just curious how much.
Yes,
So-
Assemblymember Bryson, I think you're doing it correctly. If you were to divide that number by 3%, you'd back into a total marijuana sales, something in that ballpark. Okay, tobacco tax. Tobacco tax is the hardest tax we project. I don't really even try. I just project the same amount from last year. Tobacco tax is subject to all of these conflicting factors. One, tobacco continues to get more expensive. Fewer and fewer people are smoking. Vaping products continue to grow in popularity and seem kind of durable. We do tax vapes. There was also throughout this picture, this graph, throughout the numbers you see on this page, there were several changes in the tax rate made by the assembly. It's a very hard tax to forecast. But I think ultimately, if you look at that total along the right-hand column, it's been pretty much the same number for a long time, between 2.7 and $2.9 million. So we're just project right into that. That is everything on that section of the major revenues. And I will save things on page 11 and 12 until we get another click forward.
Okay, so we are moving on to number 4 then. Is that you're ready to do that? Okay, let's move right on.
Chair Treem, so page 4, we've tried to do better of getting more useful summary information into the budget book. So a lot of items that used to be in the packet in prior years, we're trying to get into the budget book. The one exception to that are the 2 reports from the assessor. So the assessor has done these reports for a couple of years now. And we share them with the assembly in this meeting of the Assembly Finance Committee. It's odd for me to present these reports because I don't write these reports at all. I don't write one word of them and I don't review them. The assessor has broad independence and latitude to determine assessed values. Under the sort of technical direction of the state assessor, I think that, the state assessor is an important figure in the way that the local assessors do their work. But if you look at page 3, what is packet page 10, there is some summary information here. Single family homes went up by 16% on average. That on average by neighborhood was as much as 21% downtown, as little as downtown, meaning this side of downtown, as little as 10% in the Flats neighborhood. That difference is largely because there was a significant increase to the Flats neighborhood last year. So those things do balance out over a couple of years. We had a lot of questions about how many sale prices we got in recent years, especially during the period of mandatory disclosure. What you see in this, that we were about 600 residential sales in Juneau in calendar year 22, and we got sales prices for about half of those. That's a bumper crop. So we did have a lot more data coming into this year's assessments than we have in previous years. And because we used 3 years of sales, those number of sales will continue to benefit us in terms of understanding what's going on with sales prices. I don't probably need to tell anybody in this room that homes are selling fast and for high prices. That probably has started to trail off now, meaning in the last 4 or 5, maybe 6 months. But we didn't see enough sales where prices had been depressed in FY22 to indicate any kind of a trend for values as of the 1st of January. Commercial properties conversely only increased by 6%, and that does that 6% overall increase includes a 5% decrease for downtown properties. We've been the 50% increase to the base value of land appears now maybe to have put some downtown properties over equity relative to the rest of the borough. So now it's a matter of, we got commercial properties up to a much more sensible level. It is now about trying to trim and get property values throughout the borough on a commercial basis to be equivalent to each other, which is very difficult to do because we have a very limited number of sales. Page 26 of the packet has a few introductory comments on the commercial assessments, 6% increase overall, 5% decrease to downtown. 8% to warehouse condominiums, what I think most people here call boat condos. No changes to boat houses, which are the structure in the harbor. That's the reason we're trying to differentiate those two terms. But there was a comment here about how many disclosed sales we've got, and I lost it. I guess on the next page. I'm sorry, I had that number and lost it. But I think there were 50 some commercial sales in 22, and we got about half of those also. So 10, is that where that's at? Madam Mayor, it's giving me a lifeline. One second. Oh, it was right there. Yeah, 52 recorded transactions, commercial transactions in 22, and we have sales information for 29, so a little better than half. Any questions about this?
Thank you, Madam Chair. That's maybe a weird, impossible question. How, is there in the United States, one way? I mean, I saw in the reports that there's three different, there was the cost factor and the whatever, there was three different kind of methodologies or something. How many different ways do people assess properties throughout the United States? Anyway, I know this is a weird question, but is there the main way and then there's the other kind of way? Anyway, can you
Yes.
how much variation
Yeah,
is there?
Member Smith. So the IAAO standard identifies three methods of valuation. Cost, which is what is the land cost? What is the building cost? That's cost. Sales or market approach, which means irrespective of how much it costs, what could you sell it for? And income, which means irrespective of how much it costs or how much could you sell it for, what kind of income could you derive from it, and then apply some reasonable rate of return, and you would back yourself into a value. So those are the three approaches. The IAAA considers all of those approaches to be valid. There are different situations where each approach might be more valuable than the other. But the one thing that I would say, and you've seen this in several of the communications that you've gotten from your constituents, many states, many jurisdictions artificially cap the growth of assessments for one reason or another. I've shared with at least one of you, I could share it more broadly. There are a large number of research papers on that subject that encourage local government bodies not to limit assessment growth, but instead use mill rates and percentages of taxation as a way to control the growth of property tax.
We're also not allowed.
We're also not allowed to. That is correct. So Alaska law requires that we assess at full and true value properties. That is correct.
Mr. Watt.
Just a little more color commentary on that. So the cost approach is often unavailing in Juneau. So with the cost approach, you basically to determine the value of a property, you decide, well, we'll just go buy this vacant lot and we'll build a new building on it. We don't have the vacant property really for comparable sales. The income approach, in many cases, people in the commercial world are very reluctant to give up their income information. So we're often distilled down to the comparable sales approach and trying to match the sales information that we have. So it's hard. And it can be very hard in Juneau, given our circumstances.
Mr. Rogers, has anybody on the staff written a dissertation about this?
Not yet. Fair Dream, not that I know of.
Any more questions from the committee on this?
Okay, thank you, Chair Treem. We will move on to agenda item 5, proposed mill rate, which takes us back to page 11. DOC 11 in your budget book, which is page something of the PDF, but 229 of the PDF. Okay, this is the first time we've done this in this way, and pages 11 and 12 go together, which is that I just on DOC 11, ignore the left-hand side and focus on the right-hand side. The right-hand side basically models what happens at every mill rate by 1/10 of a point from 9 to 11. Okay, it models the property tax revenue that we would receive. And then it calculates how much more or less property tax that is than last year, the percentage that it is more or less than last year. And then importantly for us, it calculates how much the general fund surplus or deficit would be after the lapse if we set that mill rate. We used this approach to calculate the 10.28 mill rate based on recurring revenue, recurring expenditure, and a $1 million lapse to have a quote unquote balanced budget. A budget that has enough recurring tax revenue to pay for its recurring expenditures without a surplus and without a deficit. Maybe by dollars and cents, but not significantly. So we have really, and this was the first time in my time here at CBJ that we've taken this approach rather than thinking we're starting with a 10.66, a 10.56. Do we want to edge it up or down? We said, let's just abandon that idea. Let's calculate a mill rate. And we use this structure to do it. I have become quite taken with the two graphs on the next page, which sort of graphically look at this question. And let's start with the bottom one because it's a little easier to understand immediately. This lists every mill rate by tenths from 9 to 11. And the bars you see are the deficit or the surplus that CBJ would have in the manager's proposed budget, recurring revenue, recurring expenditure after $1 million lapse, right? So at whatever, a 10.4 mill rate, you would have almost $1 million of surplus. Part of the reason that these graphs and these calculations will become useful is that certainly staff's recommendation will be if the assembly adds general fund cost to the budget, that you consider trimming the mill rate to that new level of spending if it's recurring. If it's one time, you might not choose to do that. You're just spending fund balance. If you're taking on a recurring cost that we should expect indefinitely, we would encourage you to set a mill rate that pays for that cost, but doesn't take in any unnecessary revenue either. You can see that same thing in the chart above this one, just plotted slightly differently. It is the year over year change in property tax in terms of dollars received by the city at various mill rates. It is a linear equation, and you can see where we would have been at 5.6. That's the top line and the right-hand line. And then you can see what has been proposed, which is 10.28 mill rate and about a 10% increase in property tax revenue. Are there questions about this for now?
So this top graph is dependent on the different valuations in the 2 years? Is that what I'm
sorry, member. I'm sorry, Chair Treen. There's not 2 years reflected here.
wait,
It does reflect the year over year change in total property tax. So at 10.28 mils, we collect 10% more property tax. At 10.56 mils, we would collect 13% more property tax. At 9.35 mils, we would collect the exact same amount of property tax we collected last year. Does that all make sense?
no.
Maybe I'll try it a different way. A average property tax owner will look at this graph and say, okay, I get it. You lowered the mill rate from last year's 10.56 to 10.28, but I'm still paying 10% more property tax than I did last year.
But that's the difference is the increase in the valuation.
Chair Treen, yes, that's correct.
Yes, yes.
Yeah, okay, I get it now. Ms. Hale.
Thank you, Madam Chair. So the answer when someone says, well, why am I paying 10% more? You have this great new tool, and why didn't you lower it? Is inflation. And for example, the cost to increase wages and some benefits for employees. So, and add some staff where we need them. So that's what we're actually talking about, kind of an inflationary 10% increase because everything's increasing.
Yeah, maybe I think that's exactly right. It's yes, inflation has gone up and things have gotten more complicated for the borough. So I think if you look at, we did wage increases last year and we still are having trouble hiring people. So we have additive wage costs. I think the increments to the budget are the position increments are good ones as well. We put in for a new HR staffer because we're recruiting, hiring, training, and in some cases terminating employees more. So we've got higher HR costs. The IT support. Yes, we're trying to move more online services, but people still want to come in and do things in person and in paper. So we're really operating in dual worlds. And software is not cheap and it doesn't last a long time. I'm blanking on the other one. So the commercial assessor, right? We've had a lot of heat and a lot of grief from the public over valuations, and the voters turned down mandatory disclosure. And in order to properly value people's properties, we need more staff. And then the last piece, which kind of the grab bag of the Parks and Rec functions, we have the most accessible programs in the community, and they often sell out in 30 or 90 seconds. So only the most able and organized parents are getting kids into those programs.
Chair Dream, I'll just add one more thing here too. I think we underestimate the impact of schools. If you take 10.28, subtract 1.2, that's voter approved debt. That leaves you 9.08. Of 9.08, 4.65 is the minimum required and the maximum allowable contribution to schools. So 9.08 is made up of 4.65 plus an additional amount really for above the cap that I'm not even talking about, but there is an additional amount for that. So realistically, you're spending more like 4.75 or 4.8 mils on schools. But if you're just spending 4.65 mils on schools and you're spending 1.2 on debt of property tax, you are only spending 4.43 mils on everything else CBJ does. We are spending more property tax on the Juneau School District than we are spending on everything else that CBJ does in its general government. And I'm not critical about that at all. It's just the numbers. And I think we get a little distracted thinking that property tax pays for all of government in a way that it just doesn't. More than half of the non-debt property tax is paying for schools.
Mr. Smith.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Just on that, no sales tax goes to schools though, correct?
Mr. Smith, that's exactly correct. So 5% sales tax, 1% of that goes to voter approved projects, 1% of that goes almost entirely to streets. The other 3% of sales tax is what pays for the rest of general government. That is correct.
Mr. Watt.
Except for school facility maintenance, we do put sales tax into those projects.
Thank you. Just something, I was trying to find it in the manager's message, and I don't know if I saw percentages and I wasn't fast enough on the calculator to figure it out. So property tax valuation, sorry, went up by how much again? My God, sorry, 1 second.
The left-hand side of DOC 11 might help you.
Yep. So it went up by total assessed valuation increase was 13%. Do you, not including the new city hall or just kind of that, what is our increase in expenditures for the stuff we're already doing? And you can include the new positions and stuff. Do you know that? Do you have that? Is that number somewhere?
Thank you, Assemblymember Smith. It is that number. If you look at page 22 of the budget book, and I'll just point to a couple of numbers, or I'll point to one little paragraph I spent some time looking at with Madam Mayor. The second little paragraph on page 22 of the budget book reads, all told, these proposed changes add 8.3 million of new recurring costs. That's operating and CIP to the CBJ general fund budget over F23. That amount, 8.3 million, does not include an additional 2.3 million for schools, but those two numbers together total $10.6 million of what we think of as general fund expenditure growth from 23 to 24.
There's also on page 23, Mr. Smith, I think might be.
Executive summary page.
Yeah, the two right-hand columns are percent changes. And I think, let's see. The second to last column, that's comparing the budget that we're looking at with last year. Is that correct?
That's correct.
So you can see the kind of by whatever those are changes.
So obviously we've been getting a lot of, feedback and comments about property tax and things. And if there was obvious growth in the value of people's homes and properties in the last year, I think that's like undeniable. Some, and assessing isn't perfect, and people should, and hopefully did, but a couple of days ago, do appeals. I guess just knowing that there is that increase in growth, and obviously we have to set the mill rate, and we're limited that we have to I'm not saying it the correct term, but we essentially have to tax everyone the same, right? I mean, we can't say, oh, this is your second home, we can charge you as different. I mean, the mill rate applies to everyone essentially the same. But anyway, the people I'm thinking of are like this low income senior in a $200,000 condo who, they're not getting more revenue, and like Social Security isn't going up. Anyway, and we've talked about some ways to put, how do we try to help those people?
Yeah, thank you, Assemblymember Smith. I mean, I think that's exactly the question. Alaska state law does not allow differential application of a mill rate to assess value. So except by service area, which doesn't allow you to identify specific individuals or homes. So no, we do have to tax all properties in the same way. As we've talked about before, the state law does have a provision for a kind of homestead exemption, a residential homeowners exemption. In state law today, that amount would start at $50,000, and then it would be adjusted by inflation going forward. So, and that I believe CBJ could enact that to be additive to the senior exemption that already exists, or to not be additive. But you could do that. That is something you could do. That's in the Assembly's power today.
Ms. Hale.
Did Mr. Watt have something to add? Okay,
I was just going to make sure that the senior tax exemption was mentioned, and everybody remembered that there's the first 150,000 is exempt.
and I also think it's really important that we remember that there is a hardship exemption. That if the hardship is serious enough, as I understand it, that exemption can go all the way to zero. I mean, like, it can really take care of a lot of property taxes, and that comes after the 150,000. For seniors and disabled veterans, and I'm not sure what else, but that's important too. So if you have no money, you can apply for that exemption, and you don't have to pay, you pay very little property tax.
Okay, no, we don't see hands on Zoom. So have we run ourselves out of question on 11 and 12? DOC 13 is an interesting graph. I actually have a little longer history of this graph now that I've worked on in the last couple of days, but this is from 1998 to 24. And you can see that where we wind up in FY24 is the lowest in this entire period with for the total mill rate. Since 2007, we 1 year where it was lower than this, but that was only because the debt portion was lower that year. The operating mill levy has not been lower than it is proposed to be next year since, according to my records, 1988.
That was a good year.
So
He said that was a good year. Some of us, yeah.
So we are looking at, I mean, there's no other way than to describe this as a historically low mill rate. Both on an operating basis and with debt service, it's just historically a low watermark.
Mr. Rogers, will you share this with us? Because it's pretty cool. I got a sneak peek of the expanded version, and it's very
Yes.
interesting.
Chair Tree, I will. I'll send that out.
Yes.
And so so I am thinking about it, like, so it might be the historically low mill rate, but there were, as we saw in those valuation reports, I mean, some neighborhoods that and again, I'm not saying that the data is incorrect, but like the overall impact to the people living there, I mean, their value could have gone up 20%. And if the mill rate drops by whatever, 0.3 of a mil, I mean, the impact would still be, I mean, anyway, there's still, and I know, and you hadn't said anything different. I just want to put it out there that like, sure, we're dropping the mill rate to a below this level it's been in decades, but due to increases in valuation and due to those increases that are not uniform across the borough, I mean, some people will still see very significant increases on their tax.
Yeah, I think Assemblymember Smith is really hitting the nail on the head here. And you're making exactly the right point, which is that a general concept of property taxation is that you could maintain the same rate indefinitely. And the reason that that works is that presumptively property values would rise and generate more revenue to pay for government at about the same rate that government costs rise, right? So we might say, oh, it's 10% more property tax. But that accords with the fact that municipal costs for providing the same services are rising at the same rate, right? The idea is not, there's no concept that makes any sense where you think that you have a property taxation rate that just goes down forever because property becomes worth more, because government would have less and less money to pay increasing costs. It's the reason that thinking that we have a 1% property tax rate over a very long period of time, it works because property values rise over the long period at about the same rate that government expenditures rise over that same long period, right? So the mill rate will naturally oscillate within a narrow range just to accommodate kind of timing difference. Property values might go up or down a little differentially from government costs going up or down, but you definitely see that in order to pay for government, you need a mill rate that accommodates rising and falling property values. So for example, I think this is one thing important to say in the mill rate discussion. You now have a mill rate that the managers proposed that would allow you to increase the mill rate for FY25 if property values stagnate or fall, which you would need to do in order to pay for the same level of government services. Right? That mill rate would need to oscillate up because property values were stagnant or fell at the same time that government costs probably aren't going to stagnate or fall. They might trim off a little bit, or we might choose for government to spend less. But there's a reason why higher property values generate more revenue to pay for government services. It makes a lot of sense over the very long term.
I wonder what this graph would look like if our property values, I think Mr. Bartholomew used to say we had a Teflon housing market. We've only gone up, but that's not the case in every part of the country. So in a different universe, I wonder what this graph would look like. Any follow-up, Mr. Smith?
Okay, Chair Trima, I think if there are no more questions on the mill rate, obviously we will have more conversations about the mill rate. We're going to come right back to these same documents. So I think as you work through all of your budget decisions, you can come back at any time to these pages and say, if I want to add $1 million to the budget, I could pay for it with a mill rate of 10.5 or whatever, right? This is a good tool to use to do that. Okay, moving on. This is just the slightest overview of debt service. I know this is like the most boring part of the presentation, so I'll move quickly, but pages 15 and 16 in the documents, you can see here our actual projected and forecast debt service. Really, the debt service fund is supposed to come to zero and remain at a zero balance. There are some reasons why that doesn't happen, but they're mostly timing differences. This is a year where we maintain the 1.2 debt service mill rate by paying off a very large portion of the Parks bond that the public approved last fall. It made sense to take full advantage of the headroom on that debt service mill rate and to retire that debt as rapidly as possible. Doing so allows future assemblies to have as much debt capacity as they can. Perhaps more importantly, if we go down, oh, by the way, this does reflect that the airport would reimburse us for their very last portion that they can from their CARES funds, which I don't know if they will come to you this year and ask you for that to be reversed, but that has been a request for several years that the Assembly has denied. So there's one more year of that. That's the last year of that, where they can use CARES funds to pay the airport portion of general obligation debt.
May I speak to that?
Yeah. A question?
Uh,
Go ahead, Ms.
You floored me there. I was trying to figure out how to formulate it as a question.
Like I can.
I can't. Okay, thank you. About that, that airport reimbursement, I would be really interested in, when we meet with the airport board, in actually really talking through that a little bit. And maybe I need to meet with, Mr. Rogers and, Ms. Watto or something. I think they might need it more than we do. So I would really like to reconsider that. It snuck up on people. It was in the heat of the moment. We didn't reverse it last year. I'd really like to look at that.
We will have a chance to do that on April 19th.
So I just think, it's page 16 of the document portion of the packet, which is packet page 234. This is a really stunning situation. It reflects an enormous capacity for debt in Juneau without raising the mill rate. I don't exactly know, but I would guess that I could work with our financial advisor and issue $100 million bond for 30 years inside our current mill rate, so long as we didn't start making payments until FY25. It's just really, really, really significant debt service capacity within the current debt service mill rate without increasing it. So it's a big number. There's a lot of debt capacity here. The other thing, I was just saying this to our bonding team today, there's no magic about the 1.2 number. Voters have the authority to approve any amount of debt. And it's just 1.2 has been a pretty consistent number. It has been as high within the last couple of decades as like 1.5 and change. So we have adopted 1.2 as kind of a working boundary for the debt service mill rate. And we kind of think about debt service capacity in terms of the 1.2 mill rate, but there's no magic about that number. The public could approve even more debt than that. If everybody in the community was excited about a 1.5 million debt service mill rate, I might be able to issue $200 million of debt for 30 years. I mean, we're talking really, really big numbers.
We could definitely send it. Ms. Hale.
This is a question. So when you talked about the absorbing or paying for the bond for the Parks and Rec, where is that reflected here, Mr. Rogers?
It's reflected, Assemblymember Hale, it's reflected in the one line for required debt service. I will say that this is a large spreadsheet that has all the individual bonds listed. It's very interesting for us. It's not very interesting reading. We collapsed that into the line for required debt service. So in FY24, you see the required debt service is 9.49 million. More than 3 million of that is to retire the first half of the parks bond.
Cool, thank you.
It's the second line on DOC 15. I should note here, just because we've spent so much time talking about it, and I would love to never talk about it again. We do reflect 100% school bond debt reimbursement in FY24 and FY25. And I would expect, based on the tenor of the governor and the legislature, that will be reimbursed in the budget.
I also would like to never talk about that again. Mr. Watt, this cliff kind of scares me. So I'm thinking of things that we could issue debt for. Do you have an opinion on bonding for the JPD radio system? That seems like a good one.
Thank you, Chair. I think police radios could be a good one. We're still hopeful that we'll get some federal funding. But it could be a good one that we could bond for the radios, and you could actually pull back the general fund that we've allocated to date. Certainly we're gonna inexorably have requests on school facilities. I think that could be another good one. It's City Hall partial funding, another good one. Cost of capital projects certainly is been jaw-droppingly high. So all of our major facility maintenance projects. I think there's room to put together a package of all kinds of ideas.
Chair Treme, I want to make one little connection while we're talking about debt and the mill rate. And this kind of goes back to us talking a little bit about Ms. Flick's work on looking at fund balance. Because you have such significant capacity for debt, it would lead you to a slightly lower need for a large unrestricted fund balance. If it does that make sense, right? If you had no debt capacity or there was no public tolerance for debt, I might reasonably encourage you to have higher levels of fund balance because it's the only way you'd pay for anything. But part of the reason you don't need 10 million, 15, 20 million in unrestricted fund balance is because Juneau is a community that does use debt structures to pay for big stuff. If you wanted to pay for a $10 million thing tomorrow, if the public was willing to vote in the affirmative on it, it would only eat up just another thin slice of this total capacity. I think you've seen we have this chart is driven by a model where we can model in a debt issue. And if I put in $10 million for 20 years, you'd see a little layer on top of this with the mill rate never exceeding 1.2, and it would still fall off. You could issue 10 million of debt next year and the year after and the year after and the year after and the year after. And that is really the way that so for example, that's the way utilities operate. They issue $10 million of debt every year. It's just the way they do business, right? Because they're always retiring that much debt and they're always reissuing it. It's interesting in that regard, but you have considerable debt capacity. You could issue lots of small bonds. You could issue a big bond. You have ways to pay for stuff without using fund balance.
Ms. Hughes Candies and then Mr. Smith.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Ms. Hale noted earlier that housing is our number one, or it's been our stated number one priority, or we've talked about it a lot. I know it's a less traditional vehicle, but I have been intrigued looking at models from different parts of the country where communities have bonded to do city-led affordable housing. And Mr. Watt, I don't know if you want to say anything about that, but when I hear those big numbers of our tremendous capacity for debt, that is the first thing that jumps to my mind, although there are many worthy projects, City Hall being among.
Can I say just one thing before
Yes.
Mr. Watt jumps in?
Yeah, please.
By charter, we can only issue debt for city infrastructure. I think a city housing project is interesting, right? I think it would require some legal thinking to think about whether or not that meets the test of city infrastructure, unless we intended to own it and operate it as a city facility. And then I presume that it would.
A follow-up to that, because I note that I've been trying to, I know it's a totally weird one because of that, but and we can talk more on this offline, but if it was intended to be a piece of city infrastructure, could we not have that not operated by the city? I mean, do you feel like that would meet that test?
I think it would probably be a legal question, but I think it points toward a fair question to ask. We would get to an answer, but we certainly wouldn't reject it out of hand.
Okay, I'll follow up with legal.
Mr. Watt, do you have anything to add?
So we, in the budget, I think we have 2.5 million of available funding for the Affordable Housing Fund this year. So, anything we do on housing costs money, and it really comes down to who is going to do housing projects. And we've focused on the nonprofit sector and then the private developer sector. Those are the two sectors. So the city venturing into housing development, I'll be honest, sounds kind of frightening to me. I think we can have very interesting conversations on that. But to date, I think our best blend of public money and private activity really is the senior housing project. Right. And we were in, if everybody remembers, the reason we were able to do that in the way that we did it and be comfortable is we owned the land. We said, we have this piece of land, you want this type of development, and we're willing to give cash subsidy. And when you bring that competition in, all of our public policy issues are a lot easier. And the reason we were able to bring the competition in is we owned the land. So if we can find, Second Franklin lot, I think is another candidate for that, or potentially Telephone Hill. We're going to have candidate pieces of land where I think that model can be very good.
But we can't give away land because of our charter, so we still have to have cash on hand for those types of deals.
Probably a long answer, and there's no attorney here.
She's right there.
Oh, we've got an attorney there. Can't give a go. Oh, yeah, keep hiding, keep your head down. It's tricky. I think it's tricky because we're going to be looking at things, and we're going to be looking at the public purpose clause in the Constitution. Everything we do has to have a public purpose. We're going to be looking at our land use code, our land code, which says that we sell land at fair market value, and whether we have appetite to not sell at fair market value. It's tricky, I think, is my best summary.
Mr. Smith.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Just really quickly, Mr. Rogers, you said the 1.2 is not some set number. It can go up and down depending on the voters. The voters, that's just done when they vote to approve projects, and we say, and then we'll like inform them what that would raise the mill rate, the debt service mill rate to. That's how they're approving whatever the mill rate is, or
Yeah.
the debt service mill rate.
Mr. Smith, there's some nuance and it's a little complicated, right? So any amount of voter approved debt as a general obligation of the city, we pledge the full faith and credit of the borough to that we will repay that debt. When we put ballot questions in front of the public, we usually give them estimates for what that would cost in terms of the mill rate, and saying it would raise your property taxes by a certain amount. At the same time, we are always trying to creatively structure debts so that they do not overburden the public, and at the same time, they take advantage of whatever debt capacity we have. So the decision that eventually gets made is about a debt structure that may pay off a bond over a longer period of time, which means it costs a little bit less, or costs paid over a shorter period of time, it costs to be a little bit more. The point is that the voters approved $6.6 million of park bond. That's the key piece.
Any more questions on debt service? Mr. Bryson.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I wanted to give just a slightly different perspective. I think that the Assembly has been very diligent about being just super careful with our budget. I mean, we worry about every nickel, we worry about every dime. That's what's put us in this relatively very healthy financial position. Now, while I appreciate speeding up and paying off $3 million of that park bond, one of the biggest pushbacks from the public is they're concerned about what the mill rate is finally going to be. If we don't rush to pay the $3 million and pay the park bond, which the voters okayed for us to borrow, and we paid that back over a longer period of time, we could have a lower debt service rate, and we could legitimately lower the mill rate to the lowest point in decades, which that message going to the public would be huge. That's what their concern is. We show that we're using that same level of responsibility. When I look at this chart, I've got the scenario in my head. We've been working hard as a family. We got the cars paid off. We got the credit card paid off. And then one of the family members says, well, we need a new car. So we've got the debt capacity. Let's go get a new car because we can afford the payment. But if we kind of go in the same course of action that we've been doing, this very cautious, we've got a whole bunch of records. Do you know what follows records? A crash or a dip. Records you don't always continue to break records indefinitely. Eventually we will have a dip. And this very cautious, careful approach that we've done for the budget was put us in a great position. And so while you are correct, and I appreciate showing the big numbers before anybody got really excited about, oh my gosh, what can we go buy now? We've done a lot of diligent work to get to this. We can lower the cost of living in Juneau and still have the capacity to do things like finance at City Hall. I'm picking a crazy one there. But I just wanted to, while we're in a great position and none of you have been wrong about the things that we could be doing, they're all great ideas. I also wanted to point out the perspective of this is a result of our hard work and other assemblies, very hard work to get us in this great financial position. And we can make Juneau benefit from it. So thank you for allowing me that time.
Thank you, Mr. Bryson. Any final questions on that? Okay, let's move on.
Chair Treem, if you'll indulge me, I'm going to make a very minor distraction. So go to page 66 of your budget book. Because I do think this is something that is becoming a big priority for the assembly, and I think we need to do a better job of getting it squarely on the agenda. The bottom of page 66 of the budget book is the Affordable Housing Fund. And I'll just point out a couple of numbers here so that you know where you're at on housing. At the end of FY23, you're projected to have almost $4 million, 9.93979,300 as the fund balance of the Affordable Housing Fund at the end of this current year. The FY24 budgets to spend 2.626. That number can be higher or lower. We set that because it was about the amount that you spent this year from that fund. Obviously, as you know, we've struggled in recent months. There were several funded projects that were kind of just difficult to get to deals on. These are difficult deals to make. So there's a possibility that there just won't be that many applications. There won't be that many deals we could actually make next year. Whatever you don't spend would wind up in staying in the Affordable Housing Fund balance. But by the end of FY24, the Affordable Housing Fund would be drawn down to 1.1343 million. And eventually there is 1% sales tax that comes back into this also. I think one thing that I think you all could ask the chair is if you want to put a discussion about the Affordable Housing Fund on the agenda, we'll do that whenever you want to.
Ms. Hale.
Thank you, Madam Chair. So I think Mr. Rogers, what you just said is that of the list that was selected, there's a lot of projects that can't get off the ground, and so they're not able to spend that money yet. Is that correct?
I think that's fair. Something, yes.
Thank you. And I think it would, and I'm not sure exactly how to try to incorporate, we will have a lot to talk about, but it would behoove us to think about getting more money into the fund sooner, or getting more money allocated to spend sooner, especially knowing what we've just heard. Thanks.
Okay, Chair Treem. So if folks are ready to move on, item 7 is just an overview of the cost allocation. I don't know that we'll belabor this necessarily. We put it in here because enterprises end up saying to you, oh, our costs are really going up. And at the same time, we say to you, we wind up pulling some costs back out of the general fund budget because the enterprises pay us for the work that we do for them. You can see all of those on page DOC 17 through 26. You see it in 2 different flavors, which is that you see it in the, like on page 17, top of that page, you'll see the school district will pay us $208,000 next year for use of the attorney, for the time the manager spends on school district issues, for the fact that we perform certain parts of their accounting back and forth and the audit, mostly the audit, they do use central treasury, all those things, that totals 208. That's an $8,000 increase. So this is all perfectly transparent about how CBJ central service costs are changing for the non-general government units. And then starting on page 22, you see the reverse of that, which is how those central service units are paid for by the enterprises that use those services. So at the top of page 22, you'll see the city attorney does $314,000 of work for non-general government. Importantly, $106,000 of the hospital, $61,000 of the school district. On down the line there for both the enterprises and the non-general government funds. So the risk fund, the lands fund, the fleet fund, et cetera. You see it in both ways here. We put this presentation in the budget book, so we're fully transparent about how those costs move between the central service units, basically all the administrative units, and the enterprises and non-general funds.
Madam Mayor.
Thank you, Chair Dream. So I have a question because, and maybe I'm just missing something. When we look at the Bartlett Regional Hospital, I'm looking at page 17 of the budget book. Everybody else has human resources, but we don't have anything for that. And doesn't Mr. Hargraves split his time between us and them? So why isn't it showing up on them? And when you look in the back and look under human resources, they're not in that list. So how does that work?
Yeah, thank you. That's a really good question, Madam Mayor. It's because the hospital pays for half of Mr. Hargrave's time directly. We don't bill them for it. There are several circumstances in here like that where enterprises are paying for a very specific use of city services. We don't run it through the allocation method. Mr. Hargrave is actually a really illustrative example of that.
Ms. Hale.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I remember when we were having all the discussions about Eagle Crest and the gondola, there was somebody said that Eagle Crest's legal fees, legal allocation was gonna like skyrocket through the roof, and I don't see that reflected here. And can you explain that, please?
Yeah, thank you, Assemblymember Hale. It's an apt observation, and it's because of a time delay. So we are always looking back 2 years at metrics about usage of central services. We're looking back 2 years. So anytime an organization uses lots of legal service time, they pay for it 2 years later, which is always a little frustrating for them because they don't remember that they used a lot of legal services time 2 years prior.
Speaking of Eagle Crest, I think last year for them and maybe others, this was actually more of a partial cost allocation. Are we now up to full cost allocation for Eagle Crest?
Oh, Chair Treve, he's killing me. The answer is yes and no. I blame Ms. Spiegel for this. The answer is yes. For the first time, we do assess 100% of allocated central service costs to Eagle Crest. However, we have adopted a 3-year smoothing so that enterprises and non-general funds don't experience such peaks and valleys with their costs from more and less use. So now we have for Eagle Crest a 3-year average that reflects 100% for this year, 85% for last year, and 85% for the year before that. So the answer to your question is yes and no.
So 2 years from now, it'll be.
2 years from now, Eagle Crest will be paying 100%.
2 years from now, it'll be 100% and the giant increase in their legal fees will show up. Ms. Spiegel, remember this, please, because they're going to come in here and they're going to say, hey, what the heck? And we need to remember this. So yeah, I'm shaking my finger about that. Okay, thank you, Mr. Ryder. Yeah.
Okay, I just want to make sure I understand that. So we're always looking back. I get that. With Eagle Crest, we said in 2 years, they're gonna pay for this. Where are we in the smoothing? This year's, the last 2 years were 85 and this year is 100. So it's 100 of which years?
It's 100%. It's interesting because we are always looking at our budgeted costs for next year. So on a cost basis, we're looking at our budget for next year, not looking 2 years back at cost. We look back 2 years to determine the metric of how much of the law department's time did Eagle Crest use? 5%, 5.1%, 4.9%, whatever. So we're looking back 2 years at the metric by which we use to allocate costs. And we do all of this in a way with a consultant that's considered to be OMB compliant in a general way. We use an OMB compliant method completely for the airport so that they can charge federal grants.
So we're charging them 100% of the time they took up in 2021. Is that correct?
2022, I was going to say. Yeah.
2022, right? Sorry, we're in 23. Okay. Thank you. And that's the same for all of our enterprises.
That's correct.
Okay, thank you. Very
In terms
helpful.
of the metric by which we allocate costs.
Right. And the smoothing was for everybody.
The smoothing is for everybody, 3-year smoothing.
Great.
Okay, any more cost allocation questions? I think that's it.
It's riveting, I know. Last item on your agenda is the calendar. So keep the calendar in mind. This will evolve over time, but I think that the meetings on April 12th and April 19th are pretty well locked in. Those are the things that'll happen in those weeks. So
Hey, knock it off down there. Madam Mayor. I did want to ask the committee, typically we've started our budget meetings at 5:30 in the hopes that maybe we get out that much earlier. Is there any consternation with that? Should we keep doing it that way? Okay, we'll keep doing it that way. Okay, we're adjourned.